Picture this. A spoiled young man in his early 20s dressed in a $3,000 suit, casually stretching his feet onto a cafe table while a waitress tries to clean it. He doesn't even glance at her. No, please. No, thank you. He acts as if she's invisible. But here's what he doesn't realize. In the back corner, behind round sunglasses, someone has been watching him closely. In about 16 minutes, that young man will receive a lesson about respect he won't soon forget. Because the person observing isn't just any customer, it's Ozzy Osbourne. And today, the Prince of Darkness is about to show a spoiled rich kid what true power looks like. Brandon, the young man in question, entered the cafe as if he were stepping onto a red carpet. He looked about 23 or 24, but his confidence suggested he felt as though he'd built the very city around him. His $3,000 Gucci suit fit perfectly. A gleaming Rolex adorned his wrist, and his Italian leather shoes were polished to a near-mirror shine. His father owned the city's largest real estate empire, and Brandon carried himself like he owned the cafe too. Every other customer seemed like nothing more than background extras in his personal movie. Ozzy watched quietly from behind his sunglasses. Perhaps he had been arrogant in his younger days too, but time had taught him valuable lessons. Now he wondered, how much would this young man have to experience before learning the same lessons? Brandon made a beeline for one of the best tables by the window and sat down as though claiming a throne. Moments later, a young waitress in her 20s, hair tied back in a messy bun, approached him. She smiled warmly, though she looked tired, and said, "Welcome, sir. How can I help you?" Her tone was genuine, polite, in a way even Ozzy admitted he could rarely match in his own youth. But Brandon didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on his phone. A long pause followed. The waitress waited, her smile slowly fading. Finally, without lifting his gaze, Brandon said, "Espresso. Make it quick. I'm in a hurry. No courtesy. No acknowledgement. Just a curt command, as if the girl were a machine rather than a person." She bowed her head slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll bring it right away," she replied, then walked toward the kitchen. Ozzy set his cup down and continued watching Brandon. A thought crossed his mind. "Ah, kid, you still don't know what surprises life has in store for you." But he remained silent, observing, waiting for the lesson that was about to unfold. A few minutes later, the waitress returned, carrying a steaming espresso on her tray. As she approached Brandon's table, he suddenly rested his feet on it. The soles of his shoes smudged the spots she had just cleaned. She paused briefly, surprise flickering across her face, but said nothing. She simply placed the espresso in front of him and said, "Enjoy." Brandon made a sound of acknowledgement without lifting his eyes from his phone. As the waitress walked away, Ozzy noticed her expression. There was weariness, perhaps a touch of hurt, but she didn't complain. She continued her work quietly. Ozzy thought, this girl is strong. What Brandon had done reminded him of experiences from his own past. Years ago, he had seen similar behavior backstage in hotels and restaurants. Money and fame often brought out the worst in some people. Now this young man was heading down the same path. Ozzy sipped his coffee and continued watching, knowing that sometimes life places someone in your path to teach a lesson, and today, that someone might be him. Brandon looked around while sipping his espresso. His gaze wandered over the other patrons. At the table next to him sat an elderly couple who received the same dismissive glance. Ozzy thought, "Kid, you really don't understand how small you are in this vast world." Yet he remained silent. The moment to intervene had not arrived. Brandon needed to dig himself a little deeper first. A few minutes later, the waitress returned, this time holding a cloth as she wiped down tables. She politely asked, "Excuse me, sir. May I clean your table?" Brandon glanced at her, then at his feet and then back at her. Instead of removing his feet slowly, he stretched them out even further. Looking completely natural, he said, "I'm in a hurry. I don't have time to move my feet." The waitress paused as if about to respond, but then gave in. She lowered her head slightly and said, "Okay, sir." She began carefully wiping around his feet, silently continuing her work. The scene was unusual enough that a few people in the cafe exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Everyone kept to themselves until an older man in the back corner slowly rose from his seat. It was Ozzy Osbourne. His hands trembled slightly, but this time it wasn't Parkinson's. It was something else, perhaps a touch of sadness, as he looked at a young man who could have once been a version of himself. Now it was time to teach a lesson. Ozzy walked deliberately toward Brandon's table. A few patrons recognized him and whispers spread. "Isn't that Ozzy Osbourne?" "Yes, I'm sure it is." But Ozzy ignored them all. His focus was solely on Brandon. Brandon noticed the older man approaching but didn't seem particularly concerned. When Ozzy reached the table, he stopped and looked at him. A long silence followed. Then in his familiar English accent, gentle but firm, he said, "Excuse me, son, but I think we have a problem here." Brandon furrowed his brow, sizing him up. "A problem? Who are you?" he asked. Ozzy smiled faintly, a smile carrying years of pain and experience. "Who am I?" he said. "I'm just someone trying to enjoy a coffee in this cafe. Just like you. But here's the difference, mate. I don't put my feet on the table in front of the waitresses." Surprise flickered across Brandon's face, followed by irritation. He still didn't know exactly who this man was, but the tone alone was enough to annoy him. "Look, old man," Brandon said, raising his voice, "who are you to tell me what to do? This is my table. I'll do what I want." Ozzy tilted his head slightly, looking at Brandon as if he could see straight through him. After years on stages in front of thousands, weathering life's storms, he knew breaking this young man's arrogance didn't require yelling or threats. "The truth alone would do it. I know the table's yours, son," Ozzy said calmly. "But showing respect for this cafe and the people who work here is your responsibility too." He gestured toward the waitress. "That young woman isn't here to cater to your feet. She's working to earn an honest living." By now, other customers were watching the exchange quietly. The waitress stood a few meters away, holding her cloth, unsure how to respond. In the waitress's eyes, there was a mix of surprise and gratitude. Brandon glanced around, suddenly uneasy as he realized people were watching him. "This doesn't concern you," he said, though his voice was less confident than before. "Mind your own business." Ozzy smiled faintly and slipped his hands into his pockets. Though his hands occasionally trembled from Parkinson's, his posture was calm and steady, so much so that Brandon's arrogance seemed to shrink in his presence. "I'd love to mind my own business, son," Ozzy said. "But you know, I was once like you. Young, famous, had money and thought I'd conquered the world." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Famous, you?" he asked mockingly. Ozzy responded with a quiet smile. "Yes, son. My name's Ozzy Osbourne. Maybe you haven't heard of me, but I used to have a little band called Black Sabbath." Whispers spread through the cafe. A few people pulled out their phones to record. Brandon's face shifted, recognition dawning. Ozzy Osbourne, of course. His father had listened to his records. He was one of rock music's legends. And now this legend was standing right in front of him, calling him out. Brandon wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Ozzy continued, "You know, son, I made a lot of mistakes when I was young, too. I treated people poorly, thought I was important, made others feel small. But life taught me something important. The biggest lesson is this. No matter how much money, fame, or power someone has, no person is better than another. We all came from the same earth and will all return to the same earth." His words were simple, sincere. A hush fell over the cafe, broken only by distant cars and the chirping of birds. Brandon sat frozen at his table. His feet were still on it, but the confident swagger had vanished. Ozzy stepped a little closer and lowered his voice, making the moment even more personal. "Now, I'm going to tell you something, son, and I want you to listen carefully," Ozzy said. "Those expensive shoes of yours, that Rolex, your dad's money, none of that makes you important. What truly matters is how you treat other people." He turned toward the waitress. "That young woman right there, she might not have your wealth. She might not be famous. But while she's trying to serve you kindly, you're treating her with disrespect. Does that make you big?" Brandon's eyes fell to the floor. Perhaps for the first time in his life, someone was speaking to him like this, and worst of all, they were right. Ozzy took a deep breath and continued. "Let me tell you a story, son. Years ago, after a concert, we were heading back to the hotel in a limousine. We had a driver, an old man whose name I hadn't even asked. That night, thousands of people at the concert had cheered for me. I felt like the king of the world. When I got into the limo, I was rude to the driver. I said, 'Drive fast. Don't keep me waiting.' The man didn't respond. He just nodded and drove. But that night, when we arrived at the hotel, he turned to me and said, 'Mr. Osbourne, I'm just a driver to you, but I'm also a human being. I have a family, hopes, dreams, and I deserve respect. Ozzy locked eyes with Brandon. I never forgot that moment. That man taught me a lesson that night, and I've carried it with me my whole life. Now I'm trying to give you the same lesson. Brandon had no words. He could feel everyone watching, but this time it wasn't pride he felt. It was shame. Slowly, he lowered his feet from the table and set them on the floor. Ozzy noticed the movement and nodded slightly. There you go, he said. Small gesture, but it's a start. Then he turned to the waitress. Sweetheart, he said gently, what's your name? The waitress looked surprised. Sarah, she replied. Sarah Rodriguez. Ozzy smiled. Sarah, you've been very patient and kind today. This young man treated you unfairly, but you still did your job. That takes real strength. You're a true professional. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Perhaps for the first time, someone had acknowledged her patience and effort in such a way. Thank you, she said softly, her voice trembling. Thank you so much. Ozzy then turned back to Brandon. Now, son, it's your turn. You owe this young woman an apology. Brandon lifted his head and looked at Sarah. Inside him, a battle raged. His ego whispered that apologizing was weakness, but his heart knew Ozzy was right. After a long pause, Brandon slowly stood. Sarah, he said, his voice sincere. I treated you really badly. I'm sorry. Truly. You're here, working hard, trying to make a living, and I acted like a complete idiot. Sarah looked at him surprised. She hadn't expected an apology. Thank you, she said. I accept your apology. Brandon sank back into his seat, burying his face in his hands. Ozzy considered saying more, but chose silence instead. Sometimes silence is the strongest teacher. He turned to Sarah instead. Could you bring me an espresso too, love? Ozzy said. And one for this young man as well. On me, Sarah replied with a smile. Of course. Ozzy returned to his table, sitting down. His hands still trembled, but inside he felt a quiet peace. Perhaps he had made a small difference in a young man's life. Maybe Brandon would remember this day and treat others differently in the future. A few minutes later, Sarah returned with 2 espressos, placing one on Ozzy's table and the other in front of Brandon. Brandon looked at her. Thank you, Sarah, really? She nodded and walked away. Ozzy sipped his espresso, watching Brandon. The young man lifted his cup and drank slowly. Then he looked toward Ozzy. Their eyes met and Brandon gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Ozzy nodded in return. No words were needed. In that moment, everything was understood. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the Ivy Cafe's terrace. Patrons gradually returned to their own lives. But everyone present that day had witnessed something small yet important. A moment showing that a legend could make a difference. Not just through music, but through humanity. Ozzy finished his coffee, stood slowly, and walked to the register to pay. Passing Sarah, he said, You're an amazing person, Sarah. Don't ever forget that. Sarah, her eyes shining, replied, So are you, Mr. Osbourne. So are you, he smiled, stepping outside. The warm Los Angeles afternoon felt a little more meaningful. Brandon remained at his table, lost in thought. His cup was empty, but he still held it. Perhaps for the first time, he was truly reflecting on who he was, how he'd behaved, and what kind of person he wanted to be. That day at the Ivy Cafe, he'd come in for a simple coffee, but he walked away with one of the most important lessons of his life. And that lesson had come from a rock legend. Sometimes the greatest teachers come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, a lesson shared over a cup of coffee can change a life. If this story moved you and reminded you that true greatness comes from humility, take a moment to subscribe to the Prince of Darkness stories. Tell us in the comments, do you think Brandon really changed after that day? Or what would you have done if you were in Ozzy's place? Because sometimes, one moment of courage can make the world a little better.